if you're involuntarily in a situation of pain, suffering, of fire, temporary hell, the beauty of it is that it has the chance to purify you. We are back with another reflection on the Daily Vedantic. And today's reflection, well, it's on fighting fire with fire. How do you fight fire? It's not with fire, it's with water, right? Duh. Why do we say fight fire with fire? Well, the origin of that phrase is actually true. Firefighters do fight fire with fire, where it's called black burning, where they'll try to combat a raging wildfire by burning the area that with a controlled fire that the wildfire is advancing on. They'll burn all the combustible material in a controlled fashion before the advancing wildfire can get there. And then it has this buffer that it can't really advance any further through. So it's a little factoid on why the phrase is fight fire with fire and not the seemingly intuitive, sensible thing to fight fire with, which would be water. So that is how you and I might fight fire, but the professionals, when the fight is big enough, they actually use fire. But why is that the title of today's episode? Well, the reflection that I've been having lately is that the mind is described within Vedanta as being like a raging wildfire. And that the mind will consume our attachment, our 10,000 desires. It will not stop because it's just satisfied. Because it's, belly is full. There's only so many steaks that a human can eat before they get full. But a wildfire doesn't reach 20 acres into a forest and say, okay, I'm full now. I'll put myself out. A wildfire, like the ones happening this summer here in California, they oftentimes will not stop until they reach the ocean or until rainfall puts it out, until something else puts it out. But a raging wildfire does not ever reach a point of satisfaction and then stop. Similarly, our minds, when it's endless attachment to name, fame, wealth, when it is attached to something, it doesn't get to a certain point and say, you know what? $1 million, I'm good. You might think it will. And then the mind says, you know what? It would be cool if we had 2 or 3 million. Then you think, well, that would certainly satisfy it. And then you up your bills. You start entertaining ideas of an even bigger and bigger house or a really cool boat. Really awesome car for you and your spouse. And you say, you know what? A little bit more and a little bit more. And it just doesn't stop. A friend of mine, Justin Kahn, who's an investor in Magic Mind, he's been an investor in a handful of things that I've built, and I've invested in a bunch of things that he's built. He is the co-founder of Twitch, and he remarked once that he had a handful of friends that had sold their companies for a bunch of money. He sold Twitch for about $1 billion. And he said that friends that had sold their companies for $100 million wondered what it would have been like to sell a company for $1 billion. And those that sold for $1 billion wondered what it would be like to have a $10 billion company. $10 billion. They look up to someone like Brian Chesky that built a company at Airbnb for $100 billion. People at $100 billion wonder what it would be like to be Mark Zuckerberg, to have a company worth $1 trillion. And Mark Zuckerberg looks up to people in history, says, you know what it would what would it be like to be the JP Morgan of the 21st century? It never really ends. It never is, all right, I hit that number, 3 million, and your mind shuts off. It's a raging wildfire. So how do you combat that? Well, you combat that with the intellect, stepping in. The mind and the intellect, those are our two internal equipments to navigate the world according to Vedanta. The intellect is like the adult in the room. The mind, in addition to be compared, it's compared to the wildfire. As I mentioned, it's also compared oftentimes to being like a child. A 5-year-old is a beautiful thing, as I've noted in this podcast before, a beautiful thing to have in the house. But would you leave them home alone? The intellect is the adult in the room that allows for maximal enjoyment of what the mind is capable of. But when we are in control of ourselves, the intellect is able to step in and say, okay, that is enough. That amount of ice cream is enough. That amount of money, that is enough. But it's rare. 1 in 10,000 have a strong enough intellect to control the mind. So how do you cultivate, develop the intellect? The fastest way of doing that is through knowledge. Knowledge of the self. Knowledge of the world we live in, how it operates. Knowledge of the timeless truths within Vedanta, even just knowing that you have an intellect and a mind. Instead of just being like, well, my mind is this inner equipment and I've got my body and they work together and, well, my mind just wants what it wants. The heart wants what the heart wants. Instead of also knowing I have this additional subtle equipment. It's kind of like the thinking fast, thinking slow terminology that has become popular in the last 10 years or so. There is a capacity to think slow and think, is this what I really want? Do I really want to eat more of that? Or do I want to make sure I don't ruin my sleep? Do I really want a 3rd, 4th, 5th drink? Maybe I shouldn't because I'm driving home. Do I really want to fudge the truth in this email on a work scenario? As Warren Buffett says, it takes 20 years to build a reputation, but 1 second to lose it. Swami he'll mention often that Shakespeare's tragedies are littered with examples of one bad decision. And everybody's dead at the end. Macbeth is a good example. Saying, you know what? My husband should be king. That desire, planting that seed. Nudging that desire forward. Telling her husband, yeah, you should be king. Everybody's dead at the end. They were quite well off. Any pauper of the time would have said, all right, they've got more than enough. Why do they want any more? And yet, that's the story of all of us. Just a little bit more, and that desire can undo all of the bliss that we have. Ramana Maharshi would say, why do you leave the shade and go out and get burnt? the implication is so often we're in the shade. Got it made in the shade, and yet can't stop our minds from just getting a little bit more. But knowing these things, even just the last 3 or 4 minutes of things that I've mentioned, that we have 2 inner equipments, the intellect can step in, be the adult in the room. You cultivate the intellect through acquiring knowledge, studying and reflecting each day. That one big wrong decision can undo everything, destroy reputation, destroy worlds. That the mind, that our desires, they will not corral themselves. These are points of reflection that you can study, reflect on each morning for the next few mornings. And this knowledge, as is described in the Gita, is like a fire itself. A fire that purifies. Because fire doesn't just consume, it also purifies that which can be burnt. Those firefighters, by burning everything, by black burning and burning everything that is combustible, they purify that part of the land from the fire being able to consume it. There's nothing to consume. So the fire just tries and tries to advance. And if that black burning is the width of that controlled fire is long enough, then it just can't advance. It's corralled. We typically think of fire as consuming or only hazardous. But historically, fire was as dangerous as it could be. It also was a purifier. Fire purifies our food, purifies our water. 1,000 years ago, it would be what you would do to purify the metal that you were working with. That purification aspect of fire is often under-discussed, especially symbolically and historically when it comes to something like descending into hell. Christian writer Richard Rohr talks about this at length, that fire historically was not just something to be avoided, but fire is what purifies. And if you're involuntarily in a situation of pain, suffering, of fire, temporary hell, the beauty of it is that it has the chance to purify you. Like moments, like phases of suffering that you might have experienced before that made you stronger on the other side. The fire of knowledge purifies us. So it turns out not only in the literal, real world, we do fight fire with fire, but in the philosophical realm, it's the same as well. Fight the fire of the mind with the purifying fire of knowledge. That is today's reflection on the Daily Vedantic. We'll see you next time.